The Federal Reserve leaving interest rates unchanged at 5.25% to 5.5%, a unanimous decision in the December meeting. The Fed says growth has slowed from the strong third quarter pace, saying inflation has eased over the past year but remains elevated. It is the first time they said anything positive about inflation for a very long time in the statement. And they backed off somewhat their bias to hike, saying it was now determining the extent of any additional policy firming, inserting the word any into the statement for the first time. They lowered their 2024 Fed funds outlook to 4.6% from 5.1%, so half a point down, forecasting on average for a Fed official 80 basis points of rate cuts next year. It had forecast just 50 basis points from a higher level.
Jean Young with Market News. Wanted to go back to the stickiness of inflation question. Over the past couple of years, a lot of central bankers have talked about the more difficult last mile of getting inflation back down to 2%. Yet it's also been surprising how fast inflation has come down this year. I'm curious, do you think something has changed in our understanding of inflation? Or do you subscribe to this notion still? Or is it something different about the U.S. economy? Thank you.
I think this, we felt since the beginning that it would be a combination of two factors. The first factor is just the unwinding of what happened in the pandemic, the distortions to supply and demand. And the second thing would be our policy, which was weighing on aggregate demand and actually making it easier for the supply side to recover because of lower demand. We thought those two things were going to be necessary. Sorry, say the last part of your question again.
If there was something different about the U.S. economy.
Yeah, so it's not that it may or may not be about the U.S. economy being different. I think that this inflation was not the classic demand overload, pot boiling over kind of inflation that we think about. It was a combination of very strong demand, without question, and unusual supply side restrictions, both on the goods side but also on the labor side, because we had a participation shock. So this is just very unusual. And, we had the view, my colleagues and I broadly had the view that we could get a lot of, you had essentially a vertical supply curve because you ran into the limits of capacity at very low levels because there weren't workers and because people couldn't, the supply chains were all broken. So we had the view that you could come straight down that vertical supply curve to the extent demand reduced. And something like that has happened. It happened so far. The question is, once that part of it runs out, and we think it has a ways to run. We definitely think that the sort of supply chain and shortages side has some ways to run. Does labor force participation have much more to run? It might. Immigration could help, but it may be that at some point you will run out of supply side help, and then it gets down to demand and it gets harder. That's very possible. But to say with certainty that the last mile is going to be different, I'd be reluctant to suggest that we have any certainty around that. We just don't know. I mean, inflation keeps coming down. The labor market keeps getting back into balance. And, it's so far so good, although we kind of assume that it will get harder from here, but so far it hasn't.